Welcome back to Studio 5. Most of us at one time or another have said offhand, I'm such a procrastinator. But most of us, ironically, put off really addressing that issue. My next guest says it's possible to harness the power of procrastination to work for your schedule and for your responsibilities. Studio 5 contributor and owner of Wasatch Family Therapy, Julie Hanks, is joining me. Are you a procrastinator, would you say?
Yes, definitely. That's why I wanted to do this segment. Because procrastination, everybody, feels kind of bad, like, oh, I procrastinate this and that. But I've kind of figured out a few ways to make it work for me.
Yeah.
And be more efficient. Isn't that, it sounds so weird, I know.
So isn't procrastination kind of a negative thing? Putting things off until the very last second?
Some things, it's okay. If it's not a high priority, then it's okay to do that. So if it, yeah, well, we'll get into this because it's more complex, but it doesn't necessarily have to be a bad trait if you learn to work with it.
So it's really just working with a weakness, if you see it as that.
Or a pattern.
Or a pattern.
That's so understanding your procrastination patterns is kind of the first suggestion. So it's a way that you can gain self-awareness. So if you say there's something that you fear, maybe a conversation, you don't know the outcome. That's good to know. Ooh, I tend to procrastinate difficult conversations. Okay, and you can explore that more about yourself. Does that make sense?
That does make sense, and I'm thinking back, because I wouldn't identify myself as a procrastinator, but I work in a very deadline-driven industry, so I'm usually up against the gun just by the nature of the deadlines. And I always, if I have a really good story or a really good interview that I'm working on that I know has the potential to be really good, I always put it off, and I think it is a fear that, am I going to do this story justice? Am I going to shape this interview the right way?
Right. So noticing your patterns can actually help you kind of deal with what's underneath and have more self-awareness, which, in my book is really important as a therapist. That's what I help people do, is gain that awareness.
So if a project or a responsibility, we notice the patterns, and maybe we notice that when things feel really big or too hard, we tend to put it off. What can you do in that situation?
So I call it chunking, or just taking one bite. So break it up into smaller chunks that don't feel so big. I'm in the process of doing this with my dissertation for school. That, like, just the word brings people to tears and, post-traumatic stress.
Right.
But really, it's like, as you break it down, it's just a chapter, which is just several pages. If you can break it down into little chunks, it's like, okay, I can do that. I can write a page. I can write a chapter, you know what I mean?
It's that one step at a time.
Right, or how do you eat an elephant, one bite at a time. Just breaking it into smaller chunks that it doesn't feel so overwhelming.
It doesn't change the task, but it makes your brain feel a little more calm and at peace.
Well, and I think for me, when I feel overwhelmed, I'm paralyzed. So if I can go, okay, I asked this on Facebook, what do you put off? A lot of people said taxes or cleaning, like certain tasks. And I read through it and I was like, oh, really? You're supposed to do that regularly? I guess I'm procrastinating forever. But so if you think about, okay, if you just break those into, like cleaning, if you break it into like, okay, this day I'm going to do this little chunk, this day I'm going to do this.
Okay, all right. So you say, this is interesting to me, reading over your notes, you say perfectionism can drive procrastination.
Okay, so you would tend to think that procrastinators, it's like they don't, whatever, right?
They're carefree, la.
No, perfectionism is something that paralyzes people. It's like, if I have to do this perfectly, and because that feels so daunting, I'm not going to take any action. I'm going to put it off and avoid it because I can't deal with my imperfection.
How do we fix that? How do we tweak that?
So, and I've said this before, but go for good enough. One of my favorite sayings is, anything worth doing is worth doing badly.
I love that.
For perfectionists,
I need that frame.
It's great because it's like if you give yourself permission to do it okay or fail or whatever, you'll actually get more done. And thinking about, like, people often ask me, how do you ask me this
How do you do it all?
I don't do it all, but I've learned that good enough is good enough. If I had to write a perfect book or be the perfect therapist or perfect mom, I would not do anything. And so I've given myself permission, and then I can move through things a lot more quickly.
Wouldn't you agree that line of thinking, though, takes practice? Because I think at first, I'm trying to work on it.
Totally.
I think at first it feels like you're just lowering the bar and, in a sense, failing, not living up to your potential. But the more you start to do it, the more freeing it can become.
I have been working on this for 30 years. like really my mid-teens, I realized, oh my gosh, I'm paralyzed by certain expectations. So yeah, it takes practice, it takes time. But what I found is like I actually do things better and I do more things better because I'm not paralyzed by the belief that everything I do needs to be flawless.
Okay, we've got about a minute, so give us the positive side of procrastination, if there is one. How can you use that for good?
Okay, so I was having a conversation with my daughter who's in college, and she was talking about procrastination. She's like, oh, I kind of waited till just the day before to study for this test. And I was like, well, if you plan on that, that's not procrastination. Like, for me, if I have a deadline, say I have an article due for Studio 5. It's like I just say, okay, that night before, that's when I'm going to do it because that's when it rises to a top priority. And if you plan on doing it that way, if you plan like, I'm going to take the day off before my test and study.
I kind of like this.
That's not procrastination.
I kind of like this idea.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah.
It's like, I say, well, you don't have to feel bad about that. If that's the time you need, just plan on studying the night before.
There you go. Very helpful. See, it's all in how you frame it, right?
Totally.
Julie, thank you so much. You mentioned you threw this topic out on Facebook. You are constantly kind of keeping that mental health dialogue going online.
I love it. Yeah, so I would love for viewers to follow me on Facebook at Julie Hanks LCSW, or Twitter, Instagram at Julie_Hanks, or Pinterest Julie DEA Hanks. And I love hearing what is on women's minds.
Awesome. Well, we appreciate you kind of bringing that conversation to our studio, so thanks.
Thanks, Brooke.
We will be right back.